Hello there, dear listener, and welcome to this quiet moment of reflection as we step gently into a forgotten world. Whether you find yourself curled beneath a soft blanket or simply letting your mind drift after a long day, I am truly glad that you have joined me. As always, feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Our community is scattered across many lands, and I find comfort in knowing that, for this small moment in time, we are gathered together in thought. Now, let us return to the worn cobblestones and flickering lamplight of a medieval city, a place where shadows stretch long against damp stone walls, and morning begins, not with the sound of birdsong, but with the creak of shutters and the slow stirring of life behind them. Our focus tonight is not on kings or knights or battles, but rather on a figure far more ordinary, yet no less shaped by the tides of her time. Imagine, if you will, the life of a woman known simply as Isabetta. She is not noble, nor even a respected merchant's wife. She is a courtesan, or as many would have said then, a woman of the night. Isabetta awakens before the sun, her back stiff from the narrow wooden bed she shares with no one. Her room is small, barely wider than her outstretched arms, its walls stained with smoke from the single candle she keeps for light. A faded woolen blanket offers little protection from the night chill, and the scent of stale rushes and drying linens lingers in the air. There is no fire yet in the hearth below, and so she shivers briefly before drawing her shawl around her shoulders and preparing for another day. Her lodging lies at the edge of the city's lower district, near the tanner's yard and the fishmonger's stalls, where smells mingle and cling stubbornly to fabric and skin. The cobbled alley outside is still quiet, but she knows that soon it will echo with the clatter of hooves and the shouts of vendors setting up their carts. Before that noise begins, she moves through her morning routine with practiced care. A basin of cold water, carried up the stairs last night, waits near the door. She dips a cloth and washes her face, her hands rough from years of doing the same. Her clothes hang from a wooden peg, a simple bodice, worn soft from many washings, and a long skirt, faded but clean. Isabetta takes care to brush her hair with an ivory comb, a gift from a merchant long gone, and she binds it loosely with ribbon. There is dignity in these small acts, a quiet resistance against the dirt and hardship of the streets outside. She applies a touch of rose oil to her neck, more for herself than for anyone else. By now, the city is waking. She hears a cart rumble past, the driver coughing into the cold air. Somewhere, a church bell tolls softly, marking the early hour. She descends the narrow stairs of her lodging house and nods to the innkeeper's wife, who is stoking the morning fire and humming an old tune. They do not speak. There is no need. Isabetta steps outside, drawing her cloak tight. The street is damp from the night's rain. Straw has been thrown down to soak up the mud, but it does little good. A dog trots past, sniffing at scraps. She walks steadily, avoiding the deeper puddles, making her way toward the bakery near the square. There, she buys a small loaf of coarse rye bread, its crust warm in her hands. The baker's apprentice glances at her, says nothing, and hands her the bread without a word. She nods once, thanks him quietly, and moves on. Breakfast is eaten slowly. Seated on a worn bench near the edge of the square, she watches the city unfold itself. Apprentices hurry past with baskets. A group of nuns walk in procession, heads bowed, their breath rising like mist. Isabella sits still, nibbling at her bread, lost in thought. Her life is not one of luxury, but she finds rhythm in the routine. By mid-morning, she makes her way to the public bathhouse. It is not luxurious, but it is clean. The keeper, an older woman with stern eyes, allows her entry. Isabella washes carefully, using what little soap she has left. Other women bathe nearby, some silent, others chatting in low voices. A young girl cries softly as her mother combs the tangles from her hair. Steam clings to the windows and fogs the glass, blurring the world outside. When she leaves, she feels warmer, if not truly warm. The sun is higher now, casting weak light across the rooftops. Her next stop is the seamstress's stall near the chapel wall. She owes a few coins for a mended petticoat, and though money is short, she pays without complaint. The seamstress, a woman named Laura, offers a tight smile and says nothing more. By noon, Isabella returns to her room. She changes into her finer garments, if they can be called that. A green dress, once beautiful, now carefully patched. She adds a necklace of glass beads and slips a ring onto her finger, one that looks richer than it truly is. These small touches matter. They shape how she is seen, how she is approached. Appearance is a shield, thin but necessary. She sits for a while in the window seat, watching the city below. The square is now filled with people. A juggler performs for a gathering of children. A knight on horseback rides past, his armor clinking softly. Somewhere, a lute plays a simple melody. She listens, motionless, and soon she knows her work will begin. The afternoon sun casts a pale glow across the rooftops, soft and without warmth. Isabella closes the shutters just enough to filter the light. She has sat long enough. The stillness of the window seat gives way to the rustling of fabric as she rises and adjusts her bodice with practiced hands. Her movements are slow, deliberate, never rushed. There is time still, but not too much. She opens the small wooden box near her bed and takes out a length of ribbon, pale blue, the last of its color fading. It is worn but smooth to the touch, and she ties it gently around her wrist. Downstairs, the smell of boiled onions lingers from the kitchen. A boy delivers a bundle of firewood to the innkeeper and scurries away without a word. Isabella steps outside, cloak drawn once more against the wind, and makes her way through the now busy streets. She walks with quiet purpose, head neither high nor bowed, her steps steady on the slick cobblestones. Merchants call out prices, and children weave between carts, chasing one another in bursts of laughter. Few notice her, fewer still speak. She passes the well where a woman fills buckets, her sleeves soaked to the elbow. Another woman argues with the fish seller, her voice sharp. A group of young apprentices whistles as she walks by, their tones mocking more than admiring. Isabella does not respond. She has learned which voices to ignore. A good many of them pass like the wind, loud but without weight. Still, she walks slightly faster until the noise fades behind her. Her destination is not far, a modest alehouse near the cathedral wall. It is frequented by men who drink quietly and prefers shadows to sunlight. She enters and greets the keeper with a small nod. He nods in return, not unkindly, and gestures toward a corner table. She sits. The wood is smooth beneath her fingers, worn by many evenings of elbows and spilled drinks. The air smells of old ale and damp rushes. A man arrives not long after. He is middle-aged, with tired eyes and a slight limp. A merchant, perhaps, or a clerk. He sits without introduction and offers a small coin for her time. Isabella says little. Words are not often required. He speaks of his wife, of the long days at work, of the ache in his back and the cold in his house. She listens. Her hands rest calmly in her lap. When he finally falls silent, they leave together, unnoticed by most. Back in her room, the shutters are now fully closed. The candle is lit, casting a golden glow across the rough walls. The man speaks more now, less guarded. He removes his boots and drinks from the small jug of wine she keeps for such visits. Isabella pours herself a cup, but does not drink. He talks of his children, of a boy who wants to be a scribe, of a daughter who dances. She smiles softly and nods when appropriate. She has heard these stories before, though the names change. Their time is not hurried. There is a quietness to it, the kind born of weariness more than passion. When it is done, he dresses again and presses another coin into her hand. She accepts it without looking. He thanks her. She nods again. He leaves. The door closes gently behind him. For a while, she does not move. The candle flickers slightly as a draft moves through the room. She listens to the distant clatter of hooves and the soft whistle of wind against the shutters. Then, slowly, she stands. She pours the rest of the wine into a small dish and dips a cloth into it. With this, she wipes her face and neck, then her hands. The ritual is quiet, without rush. She changes back into her plainer gown and folds the green dress carefully, placing it in the chest at the foot of her bed. It is nearing dusk now. The sounds of the street are changing. Vendors call out final offers, and the clang of the city gates echoes faintly across the rooftops. She stands at the window, just peering through the crack between shutter and wall. A group of boys roll dice near the baker's door. A woman leads a goat through the square, its hooves tapping softly on stone. Smoke rises from a dozen chimneys. She sits again, not because she is tired, but because the time between visits stretches long when there is nothing to do but wait. Her fingers trace the edge of the candle holder. She hums softly, a tune she does not remember learning. It has no words, just a slow, winding melody that fills the silence. Eventually, there is a knock. 3 soft raps, followed by a pause. She opens the door to a younger man this time. His boots are polished, and his cloak is lined with fur. A merchant's son, perhaps, or a scribe with better fortunes than most. He looks nervous, speaks politely. She welcomes him inside, gestures toward the bench by the hearth. He smiles awkwardly and removes his gloves. She asks no questions. None are needed. He looks around the room, noting the sparse furnishings, the worn blanket, the single jug on the table. He says it is his first time. She nods. She does not laugh or comment. She offers him wine, and he takes it. They talk for a while. He asks about her name. She says it softly, Isabetta. He repeats it and smiles again. And then the candle flickers once more. The young man speaks with a softness that does not quite match his hands. They are calloused, with ink stains near the nails. He tells her about his studies, how he copies manuscripts for the city clerk, how he dreams of writing his own one day. She listens, her expression quiet and unreadable. He drinks more wine than he should, though he does not slur his words. His eyes wander the room again, pausing on the ribbon by the window, the comb on the table, the worn pages of a prayer book she rarely opens. He does not touch her at first. He talks instead about the winter cold, about the market near the docks, about a beggar he passed who had no shoes. She offers a thin smile and pours another cup. He asks if she ever reads. She says she used to when her hands were not so tired. He tells her she has kind eyes. She does not answer. The candle burns lower. At last, the moment changes. He reaches for her hand hesitantly. She lets him take it. His fingers are colder than hers. They do not speak for a while. The room grows still, and outside the wind carries the scent of burning coal from the nearby smithy. It is not unpleasant, just heavy, like the weight of the day pressing down around the walls. When their time ends, he dresses with care, as if not wanting to leave too quickly. He places the coin on the table without ceremony. She does not count it, only watches as he slips his gloves back on. Before leaving, he turns and says he hopes she is treated kindly. She says nothing. He lingers a second more, then pulls open the door and steps into the cold. She closes it behind him and leans against the frame. Her eyes rest on the floor, on the cracks between the planks. Then she locks the door slowly and returns to the bench. The wine is nearly gone. She finishes the last of it and places the cup aside. Her legs ache, though not badly. She stretches them out and rubs her calves through the worn fabric of her skirt. There is no fire in the hearth, only the candle remains. Outside, darkness has taken hold. The last vendors are packing their wares, and the sound of shutters being drawn echoes up and down the narrow streets. The baker's boy laughs with someone just out of sight. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then stops. Isabetta lights another candle and sets it beside the first, now guttering. The new flame wavers for a moment, then steadies. She changes her clothes again, folding the green dress and placing it neatly in the chest. She wears her older gown once more, the bodice loosened for comfort. Her shawl goes around her shoulders. She does not expect visitors at this hour, but it is not unheard of. Sometimes men knock late after too much drink, with words slurred and eyes unfocused. She deals with them as needed, politely if possible, firmly if not. Tonight, though, there is no knock, only quiet. She slices a small piece of cheese from the wheel she keeps under the bed. It is sharp and dry, but better than going to sleep hungry. With it, she eats a crust of the rye bread from earlier. She chews slowly. The meal is simple, but enough. When finished, she wipes her hands and places the rest of the food carefully back in its wrappings. Then she opens the window just a little. The air is cold, but fresh. She leans out slightly, looking down onto the street. The lantern by the corner flickers, casting long shadows against the stones. A figure walks by, wrapped in a heavy cloak. He does not look up. She watches until he disappears from view. Then she closes the window again and bars it. The room is warmer now, though only by a little. She adds a second blanket to her bed and smooths it with her palm. The mattress is thin, stuffed with straw, and flattened from years of use. Still, it is familiar. She sits at the edge and removes her shoes. Her feet are sore, especially near the toes. She rubs them gently, then pulls on a pair of woolen socks, mended many times. The candle is nearly gone. She pinches it out with 2 fingers and lies back, not to sleep, but to rest. The wooden beams above her creak faintly as the house settles. Somewhere below, the innkeeper's dog scratches at the floor. Her hands rest on her stomach, fingers interlaced. She stares at the ceiling, her eyes adjusting to the dark. And still, she listens. The night settles deeper over the city, drawing long shadows across alleyways and roofs. The noises fade one by one until only the occasional hoofbeat or distant clatter of shutters can be heard. Isabetta remains still beneath her blankets, her eyes tracing invisible lines on the ceiling. She does not sleep quickly, nor does she expect to. Sleep is a thing that comes slowly to her now, softened by habit, and made cautious by the memory of footsteps in the dark. Down below, the creaking of wood and faint voices mark the end of the day for the innkeeper and his wife. A chair is dragged across the floor. A spoon clinks against a pot. These quiet household rituals echo upward, muffled by floorboards and time. Isabetta listens to them as she might listen to a lullaby. There is comfort in knowing others are still moving about, even if their lives do not cross hers beyond passing glances and short nods. She shifts beneath the covers and stares at the window. A sliver of moonlight spills through the shutter's edge, casting a pale glow on the table. She watches it, her thoughts drifting. There are names she remembers and names she has forgotten. Faces, too, some kind, some rough, all blurred by time and repetition. A merchant with a stutter, a tanner who brought her bread, a mason who cried and asked her to hold his hand the entire time. These memories visit her like quiet guests, staying only as long as they wish. Outside, a wind picks up, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and chimney soot. It whistles softly past the eaves, weaving between the narrow buildings like a thief in search of shelter. Isabetta tucks her feet closer beneath the blanket. The warmth is not much, but it is enough. She closes her eyes, not to sleep, but to rest them. Her breathing slows. The sounds of the night ebb and flow like waves against the stone. When sleep finally does come, it is shallow and brief. She dreams, though not of anything in particular. There are streets she walks that do not exist, people who speak, but whose mouths do not move. She wakes once before dawn and lies still, listening to the silence. Then she dozes again, her body aching in small familiar ways. With the first pale light of morning, she stirs. Her eyes open slowly, and for a moment she simply lies there. The world is quiet. No footsteps above or below, no carts in the street. Not yet. She stretches gently, her fingers curling into fists, and then relaxing. She rises from the bed, moves to the basin and splashes cold water on her face. The shock clears her thoughts. The cloth she uses is rough but clean. She dresses quickly. The same plain dress as before, patched along the seams and slightly frayed at the sleeves. She ties her hair back with the blue ribbon again, smoothing the stray strands with her palms. There is little light in the room yet, but she does not need it. Her fingers know every item by touch. She finds the bread from the day before and eats a small piece with a slice of onion. It is not fresh, but it will do. Once dressed and fed, she opens the window to let in the dawn. The sky is pale and streaked with gray. No sun yet, only a quiet softness that signals its approach. Smoke begins to rise from a chimney nearby. A crow calls from the rooftop. The city is waking. She watches for a moment, then closes the window again. She steps outside, the cold biting at her cheeks. The streets are nearly empty, save for a few shopkeepers preparing their stalls. She walks slowly toward the square. Her pace is even, not hurried. A woman scrubs her steps with soapy water, muttering as she works. A young boy carries a bundle of kindling under one arm and nods politely as she passes. She nods back. At the well, she fills a jug and carries it back to her room. The weight of it rests on her hip, her grip firm and practiced. She places it beside the basin, careful not to spill. Water is precious. Everything is. She washes her hands again and sets out her comb and ribbon, arranging them neatly on the table. Small rituals that begin each day. The morning hours pass slowly. She mends a tear in her petticoat using needle and thread. Her stitches are small and even. She learned this skill long ago, not because she enjoys it, but because clothing is too dear to be replaced easily. When the mending is done, she folds the garment and places it back in the chest. Then she sweeps the floor with a bundle of dried twigs tied with string. From time to time, footsteps pass by her door. Some pause briefly, then move on. She does not rise unless there is a knock. Today, there is none. She does not mind. A quiet morning is not a bad thing. She sits by the window, wrapped in her shawl, and watches as the square fills again. The baker's stall opens. A man with 2 dogs walks by. A girl sells apples from a basket, her voice soft and practiced. Isabella eats another piece of bread. She thinks about visiting the bathhouse again, but decides against it. Her coin is low, and the need is not great. Instead, she folds laundry, checks the soles of her shoes, and repairs a fraying hem. The candle from last night has burned down to its base. She scrapes away the wax and places the stub in a small jar with others. One day she will melt them down and make a new one. The light changes as midday approaches. The sounds grow louder. Voices rise in argument and laughter. A bell rings from the cathedral tower. She stands again and brushes dust from her skirt. It is time to prepare. She smooths her hair once more, fixes the clasp on her bodice, and retrieves the green dress from the chest. The cloth is creased from folding. She shakes it gently and lays it on the bed. And as the city moves onward into afternoon, she begins again. The green dress fits snugly now, not as it once did. The seams have been adjusted more than once, and the fabric is thinner in places where it rubs most. Still, it holds its shape well enough. Isabetta buttons it slowly, her fingers nimble from repetition. She adjusts the neckline and fastens a brooch at her collar. The brooch is not made of gold, though it pretends to be. She polishes it with a scrap of cloth until it catches the light, then checks her reflection in the small mirror nailed to the wall. Her face is neither young nor old. The lines around her eyes are soft, not deep. Her mouth rests in a neutral shape, not quite a smile. She tilts her head slightly, observing her appearance from a different angle, then straightens and ties the same ribbon in her hair. She breathes deeply, smooths her skirt one last time, and sits down to wait. It is not long before the first knock comes. It is firm, but not aggressive. She opens the door to a man in a wool cloak, his cheeks red from the cold. He smells faintly of leather and cloves. A tradesman, perhaps. He does not speak much. He pays quickly and glances around the room as he enters, taking note of the small bed, the candle on the table, the way the floor creaks under his boots. They speak only briefly. He compliments her dress. She thanks him. He sits, and she pours him wine. The jug is half full now, and she measures each cup with care. He drinks slowly, the warmth of it softening the tension in his shoulders. When the time comes, it is over quickly. He lingers afterward, not with affection, but with exhaustion. She allows it. Some clients find comfort in silence. When he leaves, the room feels quieter than before. She does not light a new candle, not yet. She changes out of the green dress, folds it carefully, and places it back in the chest. Her plain gown goes on again, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She wipes down the basin, resets the table, and straightens the blanket on the bed. Every corner is returned to order. Cleanliness is not luxury, but discipline. The day continues. In the hallway, she hears a child laughing, chasing a wooden toy. The innkeeper scolds someone softly. A cart rumbles past in the street below, followed by the sharp whistle of a constable. These are the background notes of her world, ever present, rarely changing. In the early afternoon, she walks to the square again. The sunlight is pale and watery. She buys a pear from a girl with dirty hands, offers a few copper coins, and walks back the long way, past the cathedral steps. A group of pilgrims rests there, their clothing dusty and layered. One of them strums a lute without words. The sound is gentle, almost hidden beneath the noise of the city. She stops briefly to listen, then continues on. A stray dog follows her for a few steps, then veers off to sniff a puddle. She reaches her door and enters without a sound. The pear is placed on the table. She slices it with a small knife, eating one piece, then saving the rest. The skin is rough, but the inside is sweet. Later, she reads from a scrap of old parchment, a prayer or verse she has memorized. She mouths the words slowly, though she does not believe them as she once did. They are habit now, more rhythm than faith. Still, they offer her a kind of quiet. By late afternoon, a second knock comes. This one is different. The man is younger, taller, dressed better. He smiles easily, his voice smooth. He brings a coin and a folded handkerchief with his initials. He sets them both on the table and looks around with curiosity. not judgment. She nods and offers him wine, which he declines. He speaks more than the others, asks about the painting on the wall, a simple sketch of a bird in flight, asks where she is from. She answers simply, vaguely. He does not press. He tells her he is leaving the city in 2 days, that he is unsure if he will return. She listens. His hands are restless, always adjusting his cuffs or smoothing his sleeves. He compliments her voice. She says, "Thank you." Their time is slow, not hurried. He kisses her hand afterward and seems to hesitate before leaving. When he goes, she closes the door gently behind him, then stands there for a moment, her fingers resting on the latch. She exhales quietly and returns to her chair. The light in the room has changed. It is golden now, the final warmth of day before the cold sets in. She opens the window for a few minutes, lets the air circulate. A pigeon flutters past, and below, someone is shouting about firewood prices. She watches without interest. Then she closes the window, bars it, and returns to her seat. The candle is lit once more. She cuts another slice of bread and eats it slowly. The last of the cheese is gone, but the bread will be enough. She drinks water from a cup, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. The evening stretches before her like an old shawl, familiar, full of small folds and worn edges. She sews again, this time repairing a tear in her cloak. The needle passes through the fabric with a steady rhythm, up and down, in and out. Her thoughts drift. She wonders how many times she has done this same stitch. She cannot count. She does not try. Outside, the last of the daylight fades, and the oil lamps along the street are lit one by one. They flicker behind the shutters, casting shadows that move like ghosts across the wall. Her hands continue their work. The mending is finished just as the candle burns halfway down. Isabella places the cloak on the back of her chair and sets the needle and thread aside. Her fingers ache slightly, a dull stiffness in the joints that comes from years of repetition. She rubs them gently, then flexes each one to loosen the tension. The small act brings her a moment of relief, as soft as the flicker of the flame nearby. She leans back in the chair and listens. The street outside has grown quieter, though not silent. Voices drift through the walls, a couple arguing faintly in the room below, a cart pulling away in the distance, the crackle of firewood settling in its hearth. These sounds come and go like breaths, marking the passage of time in ways no clock could. For a few minutes, she does nothing. She watches the candle. She lets her mind rest. The rhythm of her day rarely changes, and yet no 2 days feel quite the same. Some bring more coins, some bring fewer. Some bring kind faces, others do not. She never knows which will come. She only knows how to greet them and how to say goodbye. As night deepens, she rises and stretches. Her shawl is drawn tighter across her shoulders. The room holds the chill now, especially near the floor. She adds a layer of rushes beneath the blanket to keep the cold from creeping up through the boards. It is a poor solution, but better than none. She places her shoes by the door and pulls on a second pair of socks. Comfort, even small comfort, is not something to waste. She considers lighting a second candle, but chooses not to. There is no need for more light. The one she has is enough. She opens the small wooden chest and takes out a packet wrapped in cloth. Inside are her coins, not many, fewer than last week. She counts them carefully, her lips moving silently with each number. She separates 2 coins and sets them aside, one for bread, one for the bath, if it can be spared. The rest she wraps again and places back beneath the folded dress. Her hands linger on the fabric a moment longer before closing the lid. She does not sigh. She does not frown. She simply moves to the table and pours the last of the water into her cup. She drinks slowly. The candle flickers again, casting her shadow across the opposite wall. Another knock breaks the quiet. It is soft, hesitant. She waits a moment before answering. When she opens the door, she finds an older man in a wide hat, his face mostly hidden in the shadows. He carries himself with care, each movement measured. He says nothing at first, only holds out a small pouch. She takes it and weighs it in her palm before stepping aside to let him in. He moves with a limp, slight but noticeable. Once inside, he removes his hat and looks around the room. He does not smile, nor does he frown. His eyes are gray and tired. She offers him the bench. He sits slowly, placing his hat beside him. She does not ask his name. He does not offer it. He speaks very little, only gestures once toward the wine, which she pours without comment. They do not touch for some time. He drinks. She sits near the bed. The silence between them is not uncomfortable. It is simply there. He breaks it once with a question. He asks how long she has lived here. She answers, 8 years. He nods, then nothing more. When they finally rise, the candle has burned low. Their time together is quiet, without urgency. When he dresses again, he moves slowly, adjusting his coat and retying his boots with effort. Before leaving, he turns back to her and places another coin on the table. She does not look at it. He opens the door, steps outside, and disappears into the night. She closes the door and bolts it. Her steps are slower now. The day has weighed heavily. She places the new coin in the small pouch with the others, then returns it to its hiding place. She wipes the cup and sets it upside down to dry. She does not change out of her gown. She simply removes her shawl and folds it neatly over the chair. She sits once more, though her body urges her to lie down. The bench is hard but familiar. She closes her eyes for a moment. The room smells faintly of wax and linen. Her feet are cold. She draws them up beneath her and pulls the blanket from the bed to rest over her lap. The silence settles around her like fog. She thinks briefly of her childhood, of a different town, a different house, a mother's voice calling her in from the street. The memory is distant, as if seen through thick glass. She does not reach for it. She lets it pass. Another gust of wind rattles the shutter. She opens her eyes. The candle is nearly spent. She pinches the wick and snuffs the light. The room falls into darkness. Her breath is slow, her body still. She does not rise again, but the night is not yet finished. The night carried on, unbothered by what had passed behind the shutters and closed doors. And though her limbs begged for rest and her shoulders ached from the weight of repetition, Isabetta did not lie down again. The air in the room had grown colder, heavy with silence and the faint scent of the last extinguished candle. She sat by the window for a long time, wrapped in her shawl, watching the shifting gray of early dawn creep along the wall, brushing the stone like the memory of fingers that once lingered too long. Her thoughts wandered as they often did when she was alone with nothing to do, drifting between memory and present, stitching one moment to another without concern for sequence or reason. There were faces she recalled, not because they had mattered, but because of the way they had moved, the way they had spoken, or how the light had fallen on their coats as they turned to leave. It was never the names that stayed with her. Names faded, but gestures, glances, the sound of boots on wood, or the scent of soap on clean linen, those held on. She rose not because she was ready, but because the morning had come, and with it the same rituals that bound her to the days before. The basin was cold to the touch as she poured the last of the water, and she splashed it over her cheeks with slow, deliberate motions. Her fingers were stiff, and the skin beneath her eyes slightly swollen, but she did not study her reflection for long. There was no sense in dwelling on what time took from her little by little. She tied her hair with the same blue ribbon, the ends frayed now, and stepped into her worn dress, the simple one she always wore when she did not yet need to impress. The fabric had softened over the years, and though it clung to her in places it did not belong, she had grown used to its fit and its memory of her shape. By the time she stepped outside, the square was beginning to wake. A man with a broom swept the tavern's doorstep, muttering to himself. A group of boys kicked a leather ball past the fountain, their laughter thin in the cold air. The baker opened his shutters with a loud grunt and the clatter of iron. Everything had its sound, and each of them had settled into her memory like pages in a book she had read too many times. She crossed the square without haste, her steps even, the folds of her skirt lifting slightly with the breeze. At the market stall she bought a small hunk of cheese and a heel of bread, nodding in thanks, but not speaking. The woman behind the stall was new, and Isabetta did not yet know how to read her, so she said nothing and moved on. Back in her room she sat at the table and ate in silence, chewing slowly, pausing between bites to listen to the floorboards above her or the distant sound of hooves on cobblestone. When she had finished, she folded the cloth that had wrapped the bread and tucked it into her chest for later use. Nothing was ever wasted, not when everything had a cost. She swept the floor again, not because it was needed, but because she had time and hands and a habit that filled empty space. Afterward, she opened the window slightly to let in the scent of baking bread and wet stone. A bird landed briefly on the sill, tilted its head, then flew off. The first visitor of the day did not come until nearly noon, a tall man in a green cloak with a face like carved wood. He spoke little, handed her a coin before crossing the threshold, and sat on the edge of the bed without looking around. His hands were calloused, his nails trimmed close. She could tell he worked with rope or leather, something that left a man's palms dry and cracked. He did not undress fully, only loosened his belt and removed his boots, and the time between beginning and end was short and silent. When he was finished, he dressed again with the same quiet purpose and placed a second coin beside the first. He said nothing as he left, and she did not follow him with her eyes. Once he was gone, she washed quickly, replaced the linens, and sat again at the window. Outside, the square had grown louder. 2 women argued over the price of onions, and a drunk was escorted out of the tavern by a tired boy no older than 16. She watched them without feeling, only noticing how the boy's hand curled into a fist before he opened the door, how the drunk's shoulders sagged, not in anger, but in resignation. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of coal smoke from the chimneys. She pulled her shawl closer around her and let her eyes drift toward the sky, where clouds moved slowly across the pale blue. In the late afternoon, she lit a fresh candle, trimmed the wick, and placed it on the windowsill where it would not be in the way. She changed into the green dress again, smoothing the fabric across her hips, fastening the brooch at her collarbone. She adjusted her hair, retying the ribbon so that it sat just behind her ear, and checked the seams of her sleeves for wear. Everything was as it should be, everything in its place. There was another knock, gentler this time, and when she opened the door, the man who stood there seemed almost hesitant to meet her gaze. He was young, perhaps too young, with dark curls half hidden beneath the hood of a worn cloak, and the way he held his coin purse suggested nervousness rather than confidence. Isabella stepped aside without speaking, and he entered the room as though uncertain he belonged in it. His eyes moved quickly from one corner to another, taking in the basin, the bed, the table, the shuttered window, each detail absorbed with the caution of someone who had never seen such a space from the inside. He offered his coin as though it were a question rather than a payment, and when she took it, his shoulders relaxed only slightly. He did not sit right away, choosing instead to stand by the foot of the bed and ask, with a quiet voice, if she minded if he stayed a little longer than usual, just to talk. She nodded once and poured a cup of wine. He sat slowly, his hands clasped in his lap, and began to speak not with purpose, but as if to fill the silence. He mentioned the name of a nearby town, the trade his father practiced, the long walks he took alone when he could not sleep. There was something fragile in the way he formed his words, something almost afraid to be overheard. She did not interrupt. She listened the way she had learned to listen, not with questions, not with interruptions, but with stillness. It was the kind of listening that allowed men to say what they had never said elsewhere, not because she demanded their truth, but because she did not ask for it. He spoke of a woman, one he had loved or perhaps only imagined loving, and how she had married another. He said the name only once. Isabella did not repeat it. When he finished, he sat in silence for several moments before rising and placing a second coin beside the first, almost apologetically. He thanked her, his voice barely more than a breath, and left without meeting her eyes again. The room held his quiet for a while after he had gone. She left the coins on the table and walked to the basin, washing her hands and arms with water that had already gone cool. She dried them with the edge of her shawl and opened the window slightly, letting in the breeze that carried with it the sharp scent of wet stone and distant fires. Below, the square had begun to change. The stalls were closing one by one, their goods packed away under cloth and rope. Children ran past, chasing one another with sticks, their laughter echoing between the walls. A dog barked, sharp and persistent, until someone called it away. She sat again and resumed her sewing, the torn hem of a borrowed sheet lying across her lap. The thread passed through the fabric with a rhythm that had become second nature, and though her eyes followed the needle, her mind wandered elsewhere. She thought of the man who had just left, of the sadness in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his voice, and how many men had come to her not for what they claimed to want, but for something softer, something they could not name. Her work continued without pause. When the sewing was finished, she folded the cloth neatly and placed it in the chest, her movements as careful as if it were something far more valuable. The sun had dipped behind the rooftops now, and the light in the room was beginning to shift. She lit another candle and trimmed the wick, then placed it near the window where its glow reached furthest. The shadows on the walls grew longer, but they did not frighten her. Shadows were old companions. They came when they were meant to and disappeared without fuss. She poured herself another cup of wine and sipped it slowly, the warmth of it spreading across her chest like a blanket. She did not rush the drink. She never did. There were things in life that could be endured only by slowing them down. By early evening, the air outside had cooled enough that she placed a cloth across the bottom of the door to keep the draft from crawling in. She folded her shawl over her shoulders again and sat by the table, waiting without watching the door. Time moved differently in that space. It did not It did not tick or chime or ring. It simply passed, like the wind, like smoke, like the worn steps of a stranger outside on the stones. Another knock, this one firmer. The man who entered was older, with a limp that made his left foot strike the floor slightly harder than the right. His coat was heavy, lined with fur, and though his face was lined, his eyes were alert and sharp. He removed his gloves carefully, one finger at a time, and placed them in his coat pocket before speaking. His voice was low and controlled. He asked her name. She told him. He nodded as if to remember it. He offered the coin with an open hand, palm up, and when she took it, he closed his fingers as though completing a quiet ritual. He did not ask for wine, nor did he sit. He stood near the bed and watched her with the gaze of a man used to being obeyed, but he did not speak again. When he finally moved closer, his steps were even, deliberate. Their time together was not rushed, but neither was it tender. It was a transaction, as many were, and when it was done, he redressed without comment, checked his pocket for his gloves, and left without a farewell. Isabella did not watch him leave. She closed the door slowly and bolted it with care, then walked to the basin to wash again, her hand steady, her breath even. She changed into her simple gown, folding the green dress carefully, brushing away a small thread near the hem. She placed it in the chest, as always, then sat by the window, One last time that night, listening to the wind against the shutters, the sound of feet in the alley, the murmur of voices from a room nearby. The shapes on the floor shifted as the flame wavered, stretching and collapsing with every stir of air. Isabella remained still, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed not on any one thing, but on the room itself. As if it were an old friend she was content to sit beside in silence. The sounds outside had begun to change. The louder voices of the market had faded, replaced by the more muffled conversations of those who walked with slower purpose, cloaks drawn tight, heads lowered against the cold. A cart creaked by, its wheels rattling unevenly on the stones, and a woman's voice rose in laughter, quick and sharp, before vanishing again into distance. Inside, the warmth from the candle reached only so far. The corners of the room remained in shadow, and the chill beneath the window was beginning to seep through the shutters again. She stood, crossed the room, and added a folded cloth along the sill, pressing it gently into place before returning to her seat. The routine of these small gestures offered a kind of comfort, not because they truly changed much, but because they gave the illusion of care, and sometimes illusion was all there was. She finished the wine in the cup and did not refill it. Instead, she leaned back slightly and allowed her eyes to close. She did not sleep. It was a kind of rest, but one she had perfected over years, the kind that allowed the body to settle but kept the mind alert, listening for footsteps, for knocks, for the subtle shift in the air that came just before someone else's presence filled the space. In this half state, time passed gently. Her breathing slowed, her limbs softened, and thoughts passed through her like smoke. Images, fragments, half-remembered lines of songs or prayers no longer said aloud. Her mother's hands, rough with work, braiding her hair in the morning. The crack of ice breaking underfoot in a frozen field. The smell of soap made from ash and lard. The next knock came later than usual. She stirred at once, her hand going first to the shawl, then to the candle, trimming the wick and coaxing the flame to rise again. When she opened the door, the man standing there was unfamiliar, though something in the way he held himself suggested he had passed her window before. He was dressed plainly, but with care, the kind of care that comes not from wealth, but from intention. His boots were polished, his beard trimmed. He spoke softly, with a lilt in his voice that hinted at another town, perhaps one farther west. He handed her a coin without a word, and she stepped aside to let him in. Once inside, he paused, taking in the room slowly. He did not sit, nor did he move toward the bed. Instead, he asked if she minded if he stayed only to speak, nothing more. She nodded once, gestured toward the chair, and poured a cup of wine. He accepted it with a quiet thank you, and sat with the cup held lightly in both hands, as though it might spill if he were careless. He began speaking not of himself, but of the city, of streets she had never walked, of a church bell that rang too early in the morning, of a boy who sold sweetbread in a square she had never seen. He described the colors of buildings, the sounds of gulls overhead, the way the light fell on a stone bridge just after sunset. She listened, as she always did, letting the words fill the space. He spoke of places without weight, of moments that seemed disconnected from time, and for a short while it felt as though she, too, had walked those streets, as though the salt in the air had touched her skin and the morning bells had stirred her from sleep. He spoke until the candle had burned low, until the wine was gone, and when he rose to leave, he did so with the quiet grace of someone who had not expected to be heard, but was grateful nonetheless. He left a second coin without comment, nodded once, and stepped into the night. She closed the door and stood for a moment in the quiet, holding the 2 coins in her hand. They were warm from his touch. She placed them gently into the pouch, tied the string tight, and returned it to its hiding place beneath the folded linens. The weight of the coins was small, but constant, like the pulse beneath her wrist. She undressed slowly, folding the simple dress along the seams and laying it across the chest, then pulled on the plain linen gown she wore to sleep. She sat again by the window, not because she needed to, but because the night was not yet finished, and the candle, though low, still offered enough light to hold back the dark. She watched as fog began to gather near the ground, curling around the corners of the buildings and softening the edges of the world outside. Somewhere nearby, a door creaked open, followed by the low murmur of voices, then the slam of wood against wood. A child coughed in the distance, and a dog barked once, then fell silent. These sounds were familiar, as much a part of her nights as the flickering candle or the worn shawl wrapped around her shoulders. They reminded her that the city breathed even when unseen, that others too were awake, watching, waiting, living lives that intersected with hers only in passing. She did not move from the window. Her fingers traced the edge of the sill, the wood worn smooth from years of touch. She thought again of the man who had spoken of bridges and salt air, and she wondered if the things he described had ever truly existed, or if they had been stitched together from fragments of longing and the need to believe that elsewhere was different or better. It did not matter. The story had been told, and that was enough. She leaned her head against the wall, her eyes half closed, the candle sputtering slightly as it reached the edge of its wax. The candle gave its final flicker and died, leaving a thread of smoke to curl upward toward the ceiling, where it vanished into the dark with no sound and no trace. Isabetta did not replace it immediately. She remained by the window, her head still resting against the cool wall, her eyes open but unfocused. There was a softness to this hour, a stillness between midnight and morning that asked for nothing, offered nothing, but held her gently in its quiet. The street below was empty now. Even the footsteps had stopped. Only the faint creak of wooden beams settling and the distant echo of water flowing through stone channels broke the silence. She stayed like that until her body reminded her of its need to move. The stiffness in her knees, the weight in her lower back, signs that time had passed whether or not she had marked it. She stood and stretched slowly, the linen of her nightgown falling around her ankles like water. She crossed the room and placed another candle in the holder, lighting it with the last of the embers from the hearth. The flame rose weakly at first, then caught, casting its warm glow over the modest furnishings, making them seem almost golden in the early light. Her fingers moved by habit, adjusting the shawl over her shoulders, folding the edge of the blanket left on the chair, straightening the items on the table, though none were truly out of place. These small motions brought her back into herself, back into the shape of the room, back into the quiet rhythm that carried her from hour to hour. She glanced at the pouch tucked beneath the linens and resisted the urge to count again. It was not yet morning, and there would be others before the day was done. There always were. She drank a mouthful of water from the cup by the basin, the clay cool against her lips, and then sat once more by the table. Her eyes moved toward the window, but the shutters remained closed now. She did not need to see the square again to know its shape. She had memorized the patterns of its stones, the leaning lines of the buildings, the crooked path where rainwater collected in thin, muddy veins. Even in darkness, she could picture the worn bench near the fountain, the gap between two shutters on the apothecary's wall, the cracked tile on the roof of the bread-seller's stall. These were not sights she admired, only things she had absorbed through repetition, the kind of knowing that settled into the body without invitation. The knock was soft, but not uncertain. It came in 3 even taps, followed by silence. She stood and moved toward the door without hesitation, her hand on the latch before thought could interrupt action. The man on the other side was tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the hood of a thick woolen cloak. His boots were clean, polished leather, his gloves fine and uncreased. He did not remove the hood as he stepped inside, and though he offered the coin with a steady hand, he said nothing. She accepted the coin without comment and closed the door behind him. He removed only his gloves, placing them on the table with deliberate care, as though each motion held weight. He stood for a moment in silence, then finally lowered his hood. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples, and his eyes were sharp but tired. There was a familiarity in the way he looked around the room, not because he had been there before, but because he had been in many rooms like it. He did not sit. Instead, he asked whether she would prefer he say nothing at all. She nodded, not out of preference, but because silence was easier to carry than forced words. When he approached, it was without haste, his hands unfastening the cloak and setting it aside before turning his attention to her. There was no pretense, no request for kindness or illusion. It was a transaction executed with quiet efficiency, and when it was done, he dressed again in the same order he had undressed. Before leaving, he placed a second coin on the table beside his gloves, paused as though about to speak, then thought better of it, and took his leave with a nod. She did not watch him go. She cleaned the room again, not because it was necessary, but because the movements helped settle her mind. She replaced the linens, brushed the folds from the blanket, and folded the shawl over the back of the chair. The candle burned low again, and she replaced it without thought, lighting a new one from the old before it died. She poured water into the basin and washed her hands and arms once more, her touch slow and methodical. The cold no longer surprised her. It was simply part of the task. The sky beyond the shutters was beginning to shift, not yet bright, but no longer deep night. A soft gray crept along the edges of the window, and with it came the subtle sounds of another day forming, a rooster in the distance, the clatter of a wooden pail on stone, the scrape of iron hinges opening on an oven door. These were the first markers of morning, and though they brought no joy, they offered structure, and structure was the thread that held her life together. She did not eat. There was no appetite, only routine, and so she prepared the space again. The dress was shaken out, the bodice adjusted, the ribbon replaced. Her hair was brushed and tied, the brooch fastened in its usual place. She checked the folds of her skirt, the seams of her sleeves, the hem of her gown. She stood before the window, hands folded lightly at her waist, and waited for the knock that would come, as it always did, as it always had. The knock did not come at once, and in the space where it should have been, silence lingered. Isabella remained still by the window, her fingers resting lightly on the sill, her eyes watching the faint motion of the light as it crept slowly across the opposite wall. She did not fidget. She did not sigh. Time passed without explanation, as it always had, and she met its indifference with her own quiet resolve. Outside, the city was waking at its usual pace. The baker opened his shutters with a loud crack of wood and shouted something to the boy who carried his sacks. The cart of the fishmonger passed beneath her window, wheels squeaking with every turn, leaving behind the scent of salt and brine. She moved back toward the table and sat with care, her back straight, her hands folded. The weight of the gown settled around her knees, and the candlelight flickered across her fingers, casting faint shadows that danced when she shifted. There was nothing left to prepare. The bed was clean, the floor swept, the air touched by fresh smoke and old perfume. She had done all that could be done, and so she waited, not with hope or dread, but with the patience of one who has trained her body to outlast stillness. The knock, when it came, was sharp and measured. She opened the door and saw a man she did not know, but whose presence told her more than his face. He stood with a posture that came from habit, not pride. His hands were rough, his coat patched, but clean. He stepped inside without hesitation, handed her 2 coins instead of 1, and looked around the room with quiet approval. He said little, asked nothing. She showed him the chair, but he declined. He placed his coat over the back of it and removed his boots with a slow, deliberate motion, as though each movement was a part of something sacred or final. Their time was short, but not careless. When it ended, he stood and dressed again without words, collected his coat, and left without looking back. The door clicked gently shut behind him, and the room returned to stillness. Isabella did not move for several minutes. She sat on the edge of the bed and let her gaze drift toward the floor. The coins remained untouched on the table, small and dull in the light of the second candle. She would gather them soon, but not yet. First, she needed the quiet, the breath, the pause that allowed her to return to herself. She rose finally, washed her hands and wrists, and checked the linens with the eyes of someone who had done it too many times to miss even the smallest crease. She smoothed the folds, adjusted the blanket, and opened the window slightly to let in new air. The fog was lifting, and the sky beyond had taken on the pale blue of a cloudless day. Somewhere nearby, a bell rang once. Its echo passed through the walls of the city and vanished down the alleys. She poured another cup of water and drank half, then refolded the cloth and placed it carefully back in its drawer. The next visitor arrived just past midday. He was dressed in clerical gray, his hands soft and uncalloused. He greeted her with formality, his words rehearsed, his eyes unsure. She said nothing beyond what was needed. He removed his cloak and laid it over the chair, hesitating before unfastening the buttons of his tunic. His motions were careful, as if each one required permission from a voice he no longer heard. He looked older than he was, and though he kept his gaze averted, she felt him watching her in every glance that pretended not to land. There was a kind of tremble in his fingers, not of fear, but of something heavier. Regret, perhaps, shame, or simply the weight of pretending too long. When he touched her, it was with care, and when he spoke her name, it was as though saying it aloud helped him remember something of his own. She did not ask what. She did not need to know. When it was finished, he sat on the edge of the bed and rested his head in his hands for several minutes, breathing slowly, his back rising and falling with each breath like the slow motion of waves on a distant shore. He placed a small wooden cross on the table beside the coins, wrapped in a piece of cloth, and left without waiting for words. Isabella did not unwrap it. She did not touch it. She placed it gently in the drawer beside the ribbon she no longer wore, and the key that opened a door she had long forgotten. The drawer closed with a soft click, and she stood still for a while, one hand resting lightly against the wood, as though to hold back a memory she did not want. The day wore on. The shadows shifted. She changed the candle again and swept the floor, though it needed no sweeping. She repaired the hem of a slip, folded it twice, and tucked it beneath the linens. She peeled an apple slowly, the skin curling into a single ribbon before falling to the table. She ate half and saved the rest. Each motion filled the time that remained until the next knock, which came just before the bells marked the approach of evening. The evening entered the room without asking, creeping in along the floorboards and settling in the corners where the candlelight did not reach. Isabella placed the half-apple in a small bowl near the window and brushed away the peelings with a folded cloth. The quiet had returned, deeper now, carrying with it a sense of completion that did not come from rest, but from the repetition of familiar things. She crossed the room and looked through the shutters, not for anything in particular, but because the habit was part of her rhythm. The square was nearly empty. A man swept dust from the steps of the chapel, his broom leaving long arcs in the grit. Two children chased one another near the well, their laughter soft and fading. Inside, the warmth from the candles no longer kept the cold at bay, but she did not add wood to the fire. She would wait until night was fully upon her before giving in to the comfort of flame. Instead, she wrapped the shawl more tightly and sat again at the table, turning a small piece of linen in her hands. The hem had begun to unravel, and she threaded the needle carefully, drawing it through with even pulls, her fingers moving by memory. The rhythm of the stitching brought quiet to her mind. The world narrowed to fabric, thread, and the soft sound of her breath. The knock, when it came, was hesitant. 3 light taps, then silence. She opened the door to find a boy standing there. Not quite a man, though he had tried to make himself one. His boots were too large, the sleeves of his coat turned up twice. He held out a coin with fingers that shook slightly, not from cold, but from something else. Fear, perhaps. She took the coin and stepped aside. He hesitated before entering, his eyes wide, flicking quickly from one corner of the room to another, as if memorizing it. She closed the door gently behind him and lit a second candle. He stood still for several moments before asking, with a voice barely above a whisper, if he could sit. She nodded. He lowered himself onto the edge of the chair and folded his hands in his lap. He looked at her, then away, then back again, as though searching for something he did not yet have the name for. She poured a small cup of wine and placed it before him. He did not touch it at first. When he finally lifted it, he held it in both hands, staring into the surface as if it might reveal something more certain than the moment he found himself in. He asked her name, and when she told him, he repeated it quietly, once, like a word in a language he had just begun to learn. He said his own name quickly, as though he had practiced saying it in this room before he arrived. He did not speak of what he wanted. She did not ask. He said something about work, a stable, a cruel master, a broken tool, but the words did not stay long. He looked around again, slower this time, and asked how long she had been there. She gave no answer. Instead, she folded her hands and waited. Eventually, the silence softened, and he began to speak of things not meant to be shared, but shared all the same. He spoke of his mother, of her tired eyes and the way she wrapped bread in cloth to keep it from drying. He spoke of a brother who had disappeared 2 winters ago, and of how no one in the family mentioned his name anymore. He spoke of days spent carrying water, of nights spent in barns, of a girl who had smiled at him once across the market, but never again. His voice never rose. It did not shake. It simply flowed, and she let it. She did not interrupt, did not nod, did not offer comfort. She was present, and that was enough. When he stood, he left the wine untouched. He bowed his head slightly, unsure if he was meant to say something more. She opened the door, and he stepped outside without a word, his footsteps light on the stones, like someone trying not to wake the street. She stood there for a moment longer, looking out into the dark, then closed the door and returned to the center of the room. The candlelight danced quietly, touching the walls with its usual golden hush. She tidied the space again, smoothing the sheet on the bed, folding the edge of the blanket, checking the basin, though no water had been used. The thread still rested on the table. She picked it up and resumed her sewing, the needle passing through the cloth with a sound too soft to disturb anything but her own thoughts. She did not rush. There was no need. The silence was not empty. It held echoes of everything that had been said and everything left unspoken. Outside, the wind shifted. A shutter clattered somewhere down the alley, followed by the murmur of 2 voices too distant to follow. The city was never truly still. Even in its quietest hours, it breathed. Isabella finished the seam and tied the thread, tucking the end beneath the fold with practiced fingers. She placed the cloth aside and stood again, walking once more to the window. She did not open it, only pressed her fingertips against the glass and waited for the next knock, certain it would come, though she did not know when or from whom. The space between knocks could stretch endlessly or vanish in a breath. Isabella no longer measured time by the sun or the bells, but by the rhythm of footsteps outside her door. Some arrived quickly, one after the other, while others left her waiting long enough to finish sewing an entire hem, to boil water for tea she would never drink, or to watch the shadow of the shutters creep an inch across the wall. It was never the same, and yet it was always familiar. The hour did not matter. What mattered was the knock, the presence, the exchange. The room held its stillness, and she held hers. This time, when the knock came, it was sharp and brief. She opened the door and met a man dressed in the dark tones of a merchant, the trim of his cloak stitched in faded thread. He removed his hat as he stepped inside, offering a polite nod and a coin already prepared in his hand. His beard was closely trimmed, his nails clean, and though he moved like someone used to giving orders, he said nothing beyond the required words. He removed his cloak and boots without prompting, and glanced at the chair before choosing instead to stand near the hearth. He spoke then, not to her, but aloud, as if the room itself were his companion. He spoke of business lost and letters unanswered. He mentioned a shipment of wool that had spoiled in the rain and a nephew who had joined the watch without telling his father. She listened from her place near the table, her hand still, her breath even. He did not look at her as he spoke. His eyes remained fixed on the fading coals in the hearth, as though they might judge him less than her face would. When he moved closer, it was without urgency, his hands already open, the weight of his words lingering behind him like dust in sunlight. After he left, she relit the fire and placed a pot above it, not for warmth, but for the sound. The water would boil slowly, and the quiet bubbling would fill the room with a rhythm that softened the silence. She returned the coin to its place and folded the man's cloak, brushing off a few loose threads before setting it by the door. He had forgotten it, or perhaps left it behind on purpose. She would keep it for 3 days. If he did not return, she would offer it to the laundress, who always needed spare fabric. The next hour passed in the way most hours did, not empty, but slow. She washed her hands again, though they were already clean, and pressed the creases from the pillowcase she had ironed that morning. The smell of wood smoke drifted in from a chimney nearby, and somewhere below her window someone played a short, clumsy tune on a whistle made of reed. It was not unpleasant, and for a moment she imagined the player sitting on the edge of a step, one boot off, watching the sky as the notes rose into the cold air. She knew the feeling well. Another knock came before dusk. This one was hurried, almost desperate, and when she opened the door, a man stumbled inside, breathing heavily, his hair damp from sweat despite the cold. He dropped the coin onto the floor, where it rolled briefly before settling near the table leg. He apologized quickly, almost too quickly, and sat down hard on the edge of the bed, his hands covering his face. She said nothing. There was no need. Some came not to touch or be touched, but simply to disappear for a while. He did not remove his coat. He did not ask for wine. He sat there, silent, except for his breathing, which slowly settled into something less frantic. After a long while, he looked up and met her gaze. There were tears on his cheeks, but he did not wipe them. He asked if he could stay just a little while longer, and she nodded. He did not speak again. He sat until the candle burned low, and when he finally stood, he gathered his thoughts like broken glass, one sharp piece at a time, and placed them back where no one would see. He left quietly, closing the door with more care than he had entered. She picked up the coin and placed it with the others, then sat at the edge of the bed and looked at the cushion he had crushed beneath his weight. It still held the shape of his presence, a faint outline in the linen, and she smoothed it out with her hand before standing again. The pot above the fire had begun to boil, and she poured the water into a basin to cool. There was no tea, only heat, and she soaked a cloth to press against her face and neck, letting the warmth settle into her skin. The window was now dark, the square below hidden by shadow. Lamps flickered in distant windows, their flames swaying with the breeze. Somewhere far off, bells rang for vespers. She folded the cloth and sat again, her eyes on the flame, her mind on nothing in particular. She had learned how to let thoughts drift past her, how to separate memory from the present. It was a skill, like stitching or listening, and it had taken years to shape. The candle flickered once, and she reached to shield it with her hand, holding it steady against the air. The night had deepened, and though the air in the room remained still, a dampness had begun to cling to the corners of the plaster walls, pressing its way in through cracks too small to see. Isabella moved slowly about the space, her steps soft, measured, her body following a pattern formed not out of need, but habit. She ran her fingers across the back of the wooden chair, tracing the worn grain with a touch so light it did not disturb the dust. She paused at the hearth, adjusted a log that had already turned to coal, and leaned down to blow gently against the embers, watching as one or two sparks sprang upward before vanishing into the gray ash. In the cupboard by the bed, she found a small cloth sachet of dried rosemary and held it to her face for a moment. The scent was faint, softened by time, but it still brought with it a memory of open fields far beyond the city, of a summer that felt larger than it truly had been. She placed it carefully beneath her pillow, not for sleep, which would not come for hours, but for something steadier, the comfort of repetition, the illusion of control. She brushed the sheets with her hand and turned back toward the window, not to open it, but to listen for sounds from below. The street was quieter now, its stones slick from dew, its shadows uninterrupted. Somewhere nearby, a cat yowled once and then fell silent. A cart passed, the wheels creaking under weight, though its driver did not call out. From a distant alley, a voice began to sing softly, the words unclear, the tune familiar in a way that made her chest tighten without knowing why. She remained still, her back straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, allowing the music to come and go like a breeze that did not linger. When the knock came this time, it was gentle, as if offered more out of respect than urgency. She opened the door to a woman wrapped in a woolen shawl that trailed over her arms like river mist. Her face was shadowed by the hood, her mouth set in a line that neither smiled nor frowned. Without a word, the woman stepped inside, her hands carefully unwrapping a bundle held to her chest. Clean linen, a bar of soap, and 2 small silver coins. Isabella accepted the offering and gestured toward the wash basin, understanding that the need tonight was not for touch, but for quiet space. The woman removed her outer layers slowly, revealing a chemise embroidered with tiny blue crosses along the hem, the stitches careful, the thread slightly faded. She sat by the hearth and stretched her feet toward the warmth, sighing not from exhaustion, but from the relief of being unseen. She did not speak, and Isabetta did not prompt her. Instead, she filled the basin with warm water and brought over a cloth, wringing it out before folding it neatly. She placed it beside the woman and stepped away, busying herself with the linens, the candles, the arrangement of the dried flowers on the shelf. The woman's shoulders trembled once as she washed, but no sound followed. The room held her sorrow without asking questions. When she finished, she left the cloth neatly folded beside the basin and pulled her shawl back over her arms, nodding once before placing a third coin on the table. She left as quietly as she had come, her footsteps soft, her shape disappearing into the narrow corridor beyond the door. Isabetta stood still for a long moment, then crossed to the window and placed her hand flat against the shutter. The wood was cold beneath her skin. She moved through the space again, checking the sheets, rewrapping the soap, pouring the water from the basin into the bucket she would empty in the morning. She counted the coins, not from greed or concern, but because the counting gave structure to the hour. She noted the folds in the curtain, the uneven seam in the table runner, the way the candlelight flickered differently against the far wall than it had the night before. Each detail gave her something solid to press against, something firm beneath the shifting shape of the hours. In the far corner, the old trunk remained unopened. Inside were things she no longer used, ribbons she would never wear again, letters she did not reread, a dress with fine lace along the collar, now too fragile to mend. She had once thought to burn them, but found herself unable to follow through. The past did not belong in ash. It belonged in silence, pressed between folds of linen and stored behind locks that no longer turned. She ran her fingers along the edge of the trunk, then turned back to the bed and smoothed the cover once more. The flame in the nearest candle danced sharply, as if disturbed by a breath of air that had not passed through the room. Isabetta watched it steady itself, then reached for the pitcher to refill the cup. The water was cool against her tongue, and she held it in her mouth for a moment before swallowing. The taste was familiar, metallic, like rain caught in old tin. She placed the cup back on the table and adjusted the shawl on her shoulders, pulling it close across her chest. The hours that followed seemed to fold in on themselves, one indistinguishable from the next, like linen stacked too neatly in a drawer that had not been opened in years. The candle had burned low and was replaced with another, shorter and more practical. Its base melted just enough to fit into the holder with a firm twist. Isabetta moved with the same care she always did, each motion carried out without hesitation or thought. She lifted the cup again and drank the rest of the water. It had grown tepid, but tasted no different. It was the only taste that remained constant in the room, a background to everything that passed through. At the far end of the shelf, a single feather had drifted down from the ceiling beam. She picked it up between her fingers, white with a streak of gray at the tip, soft along the edges. Perhaps from a pigeon, perhaps from some other bird that had found its way into the upper rafters days ago and left without notice. She placed the feather beside the basin, not for any reason beyond the quiet satisfaction of giving something a place to rest. She returned to the chair, smoothed her skirt beneath her legs, and let her eyes wander again toward the shuttered window. The knock that came next was neither urgent nor hesitant. It was confident, measured, like the step of someone who knew what they needed and had already counted the coins twice. When she opened the door, the man who stood before her was tall, wrapped in a heavy black cloak with a brooch at the collar shaped like a lion's face. He removed his gloves first, then his hat, placing both under his arm before stepping inside. He did not smile, but his expression was not unkind. He surveyed the room with practiced eyes, noting the clean lines, the warm air, the scent of lavender that lingered faintly near the bed. He handed her 2 coins and a third smaller one, perhaps out of formality, or perhaps as payment for silence. He spoke little, only to ask if the basin was fresh, if the linens had been changed. She answered softly, her words like thread drawn through familiar fabric. He nodded, then undid the clasp of his cloak and let it fall across the back of the chair. He unfastened the buttons of his doublet with the ease of someone who had never needed help, dressing or undressing, his fingers precise, his pace unhurried. They did not speak during his stay. He moved with control, she with calm, and when it ended, he rose without ceremony and began to redress. He returned the smaller coin to the table and placed his gloves carefully inside his hat before collecting his cloak. At the door, he paused briefly, eyes resting on the edge of the bed as if to memorize it. Then he turned and left, his boots tapping softly against the stone corridor beyond. The sound lingered even after he was gone, like the echo of a bell struck only once. Isabella picked up the third coin and placed it beside the others, then poured a little water into the basin, more for the sound than for its use. She sat again, her back to the fire, her face lit only by the candle. The city outside had quieted further, as it always did by this hour, though she could still hear the clink of a bottle from the tavern down the street, a laugh muffled by thick walls, the soft rumble of a cart returning late from the edge of town. These were not interruptions, but confirmations, signs that life went on around her in the same rhythm she had come to expect. She thought briefly of the man with the lion's brooch, of the sharpness in his posture, the way he folded his cloak without glancing down. She would forget his face soon enough, as she forgot most, but some detail would stay. Perhaps the shape of the brooch, or the scent of the oil he used in his hair. Something small, tucked away like a slip of fabric in a hidden pocket, unnoticed until years later, when it surfaced without warning. She did not try to hold on. Letting go was part of the rhythm, too. The fire had burned down to coals again, and she chose not to rebuild it. The room was still warm enough, and the shadows had settled in ways that made it easier to rest her eyes. She moved the chair slightly, closer to the table, and unwrapped a piece of bread she had saved from earlier, chewing slowly, not from hunger, but because it filled the quiet with something tangible. She poured a few drops of oil into the lamp and trimmed the wick, watching as the light steadied into a soft glow. In the drawer, the sachet of rosemary remained tucked beneath the pillow, the cloth cross beside it, the ribbon untouched. She had not added anything new in some time, though once or twice she had considered it. A dried rose petal, a broken clasp, a note left behind by mistake. But none had seemed worthy. The drawer held only those things which had weight beyond their form, though even that weight faded with time. She closed it gently, her hand lingering on the handle, her thoughts already drifting toward the next hour, the next voice, the next sound of knuckles on wood. The room had grown quiet again, but it was not the silence of absence. It was the stillness that came at the very end of a long day, when the shadows no longer moved, and the light had given up its effort to stretch across the floor. Isabella stood near the window, one hand resting on the wooden frame, her eyes not focused on anything in particular. Below, the street had emptied entirely. No laughter, no wheels, no footsteps. Only the faint rustle of wind against the shutters, the occasional flicker of a candle behind someone else's window, the night folding itself into corners. She had folded the sheets one last time, not because they needed it, but because the motion gave her hands something to do. The basin had been emptied and cleaned, the table wiped, the cup dried and turned upside down on its usual plate. Every object had returned to its place, every line in the linen pressed smooth, every cushion adjusted, not with carelessness, but with the kind of attention that comes from knowing how little control one truly has. There was comfort in the details. The world inside the room could be arranged. What happened beyond it could not. A coin remained on the table. She did not touch it. It was not forgotten, only left. Some guests gave more than was required. Others gave what they could, and some gave nothing at all but silence and the weight of their own breath. Each offering was different, each night its own shape. She never tried to match them. She simply received what was given and let it pass through her like light through cloth, changing shape only briefly before disappearing. The coin would stay until morning, when it would be joined by others or carried to market with the soap and thread. She sat near the hearth, though no fire remained. The ashes were cold now, their surface undisturbed. She traced one finger across the edge of the stone and watched the dust lift into the air, then vanish. She leaned her head back against the wall, letting her eyes drift upward, past the beams and the low ceiling, toward something not visible but present all the same. There were no prayers spoken in the room, only memory, only quiet, only the echo of things that had already happened. In the far corner, the candle burned low, its flame beginning to draw inward, leaving behind a line of melted wax that crept down the side like a slow river. The scent in the room had changed too, less lavender now, more linen and smoke, the air that follows after footsteps have gone. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, its edge frayed from years of use, the color once deep red now dulled to rust. The weight of it was familiar. It settled against her like the slow rhythm of breath in sleep. She did not expect anyone else that night. The hour had passed. The footsteps had quieted. Even the distant bells from the cloister had rung and gone. There would be no more knocks, no voices behind the door, no coins exchanged. But still she sat with her back straight, her eyes open, her mind turning slowly through the shapes of the day. She thought of the man with the lion brooch, the woman with the blue crosses on her hem, the boy who had held his cup with two hands. Not their names, she rarely remembered those, but their gestures, the way they entered, the way they left. Outside, a dog barked once and was silenced. The wind picked up for a moment, then calmed again. Far off, the sound of something falling, a clay pot maybe, or a broken latch, and then nothing. The stillness returned, heavier now. It pressed against the walls like a second skin, soft and weightless at once. Isabetta did not move. The candle near the shelf flickered once more, then settled into its last stretch of flame. It would go out soon, but there was no rush. Darkness did not bother her. It had never been the worst of what the world could bring. She stood, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to stretch her back and fold the shawl tighter beneath her arms. She crossed the room again, fingers brushing along the furniture, not to clean or adjust, but to feel that it was still there. She checked the window latch, though she knew it was closed. She pressed her palm against the table, cool and smooth, the grain of the wood beneath her touch. The night continued its quiet work outside, peeling hours from the sky, pulling stars forward one by one. She lit one final candle, not because she needed it, but because the act was part of the rhythm. It flared softly, casting new light across the room, warming the space where she would rest her hands. The silence remained, full and gentle. No ending, no beginning, only the moment between them, drawn out as long as the wick would allow. Good night.